Welcome to the Hoodoo and Chill podcast, the number one hoodoo and spirituality based podcast bringing awareness to African American spirituality in a wide range of thought provoking topics. I am Papa Seer, your host, your narrator, and your storyteller. Before the show begins, make sure you're subscribed or following the show so you don't miss out on any episodes. And as always, donations of love keep our podcast alive and give us the ability to upgrade the show, enhance our content, and most importantly, do what we love. You can use any link in the description to send your donation of love today. Now, let's start the show. Good morning and grand rising or grand evening, wherever you may be. We are here with another episode of the Hoodoo and Chill podcast. It is me, Papa Seer, host, narrator, and storyteller of the number one hoodoo and spirituality based podcast, the Hoodoo and Chill podcast. I am back after a long hiatus out of the country. I have spent time in Mexico, Panama, Colombia for the better part of this year. Definitely on my own spiritual journey. And to just be quite frank with you all, I had to take some time away from the mic. I had to take some time away from YouTube because I just felt like for me to really gain all of the gifts, all of the knowledge, all of the wisdom from this experience, I needed to just tap out and I really needed to focus on me. But I am back. I feel like I'm back and I'm better than ever. I am so ready to continue on with this journey. This podcast means so much to me, and I don't ever want any of my listeners or supporters to feel like I have just walked away from this, because if it wasn't for this podcast, I would not be who I am today. So with that being said, let us just jump right on into this because we have a lot to talk about today. I can talk about my expat journey on other podcasts, but today we have a lot to cover and I really don't want to waste time. This episode also has been highly requested in my inbox from people in my spiritual family, people that are in my supporters group. This has been an episode that has been requested for a very, very long time. Now, if you are an OG podcast listener, you know that we did with my past co-host and Toya, we did an episode on La Madama, the Black Mammy. I think it was around 2022, about 2 years ago we did this episode. And it was a really good episode in my opinion. When I go back and listen to it today, I do think that we were very emotionally charged, as the podcast tone was during that time. It was very emotionally charged. But after doing this for so long, it's going on 4 or 5 years now, I find myself having to find a balance between the things that make me very emotional when I have to podcast, when I have to bring up certain topics, and also finding that balance between emotion and fact. And I think that if anyone is going to be putting out this type of content, you have to make sure that you are laying the facts out accurately, that you are doing your history, that you are doing your research, and that even combined with how you may be, emotionally feeling about something, that it's always all in alignment. I wanted to revisit this topic today, not only because it was a fan favorite or, just mostly requested by listeners and supporters, but because it was something that I wanted to demystify at this time period in my life. Now, I'm older. I just turned 35. I've been podcasting for a while. So I do think that my tone and the narrative that I'm going to bring up today is going to be slightly different, or maybe a lot different than what we put out in 2022. I have a lot of talking points to cover. So if I go over my time today, then hey, we just go over the time. It is what it is. I haven't been on the mic in a long time, so what better way to revamp or reestablish the podcast with a long podcast today? Let's jump right into it. La Madama, Mammie, is a spirit guide. And anyone who has had any journey, knowledge of spiritualism or spiritismo, you are aware of who she is as a spirit guide. You don't have to be spiritual. You don't have to be involved in this at all to be aware or knowledgeable of the image or the imagery that is associated with La Madama and Mammie. We've all seen it. We've seen the dolls with the different colored dresses holding the broom. Sometimes she's holding children with the different colored scarves. We have seen Aunt Jemima on the pancake syrup and on the pancake box. Some of you have seen Gone with the Wind. We have seen this imagery not only in spirituality, but all throughout entertainment as well. And I'm going to talk about that today too. But the first thing that I feel like what we really need to do, and anyone who knows me or just is a listener of this podcast knows that I am a big proprietor of history. And anytime when I have a podcast like this, I feel like it's my point to share the historical facts about this prior to jumping into how this can be utilized in your spiritual journey. So before we get into anything else, I think it's very, very important to discuss who La Madama or Mammie is. Precursor, before I get started, I want everyone to know that today's podcast is not going to be so much centered around this spirit guide from the Afro-Latino sense. I think that we do that a lot. I today really want to shed more light on this spirit guide from the Black American sense because that is not done as often as it should be. However, I am still very much going to discuss La Madama. So the first thing that I want to point out is that Mammie and La Madama are separate. They, in my opinion, I think these are two totally different and distinctive spirit guides who often fall under the same archetype of divine feminine. Take that note if you're taking notes. They're separate, but they fall under the same archetype of divine feminine. So what are their differences and how are they similar? And most importantly, who were these two women? Well, from the Afro-Latino sense, I can only give you the story as it was given to me from one of my mentors from the Dominican Republic. La Madama was a Congolese woman. She was from the Congo. She was brought to the islands. She spoke the language of the Congo. She, of course, assimilated to the language of Spanish. And she was a household servant. She came to this country or to the islands with the knowledge of where she came from. She was a healer. She worked in the art of divination. She still remembered a lot of the religion from her homeland. She was one of the most respected women on the plantation, and she worked primarily on sugar cane plantations. She loved to smoke. She loved to drink. She loved her coffee. She loved children. She was a nursemaid. She did all of these things. And she was a very, very important person on the plantation because they looked to her not only as a household servant, but most importantly, as a doctor. During those times, there were no doctors. So this was a woman who had a lot of skills. Now we fast forward to Mammie. And this is where their similarities come in alignment. The original Mammie could have been from anywhere in Africa. As we know, as many of us are here that are Black American, we share so many different regions from West Africa. She could have been Senegalese. She could have been from Benin. She could have been Nigerian. The list goes on. What we do know was that she was a woman who primarily worked in the house. She was a great cook. She was amazing with children. She was an amazing seamstress. She washed clothes. She knew a lot about healing. She knew a lot about natural medicine. Again, just like La Madama, she was very skilled. Very important person on the plantation. And for many households, they couldn't be without her. She kept things moving in that house. She took care of the children. She cooked. She made clothing. She did every single household chore that needed to be done in that house. Of course, we know that many of these women, just like La Madama, remembered the original religions of Africa. Many of these women worked in divination, loved coffee because they made coffee. I wouldn't necessarily step out there and say smoked cigars, because that definitely was that was something from the islands, but maybe cigarettes. Definitely chewed tobacco, especially if this was a woman from Virginia or around, those type of tobacco plantation. Chewing tobacco was a major thing. And she might not have smoked cigars, but she probably had a pipe where she put the dried tobacco in and she smoked from the pipe. That would have been Mammie. Now, where are these two women different? Where do they differentiate? Why, Papa Seer, would you say that La Madama and Mammie are not the same? Well, the biggest one and the first one, this is where I give grace to the Afro-Latino and the Latino communities as to why they feel very, very protective over this spirit guide. First and foremost, La Madama spoke Spanish. Any of the women after her, when the original African languages were lost, their first language would have been Spanish. I'm a true believer in, if you want intimacy with a spirit guide, deity, speak to them in the language they understand. Some of you will say, well, if it's a spirit, Papa Seer, then they should be able to speak all languages. And I agree with you on there too. What I said was, if you want intimacy, closer relationship with said deity or spirit, speak to them in their language. I think that is very, very important. And it's not that they can't understand your English or your first tongue. I think anyone would love to hear the language that came first to them. Mammie spoke English. La Madama spoke Spanish. Slavery in the antebellum South versus slavery in the Caribbean, on those islands in South America, it was different. It was different. It was some things were similar, but it was different. The landscape was different. The crops were different. The people were different. The cultures were different. The food was different. So what La Madama may like to eat may not be the same thing as what Mammie likes to eat. These were two different women from two totally different backgrounds, from two totally different countries. I think what we have to stop doing is grouping them as the same person, same archetype, 100%, similar stories, absolutely. But I think that what we have to stop doing, us as Black people, whether we are from the Afro-Latino community, the Black American community, is chastising one another and saying, you can't use this one, or we have to stop doing that and just understand that people feel a reason because this is a woman, this is a spirit guide that is specifically connected to their specific culture. I truly believe that here in Black America, a lot of us prefer to use the name La Madama versus Mammie, because when you say that word, it triggers us. It sparks up a lot of hatred, a lot of hurt. It takes us directly back to Jim Crow. It takes us back to slavery. And it really, truly does trigger a lot of people in a way. And, I'm not saying you're right or you're wrong when you do this, but this is just my personal opinion. I think a lot of people choose to use the word La Madama when really you're trying to have a connection with Mammie because it just sounds sexier to you. But La Madama in Spanish means literally nanny. Nanny is not too far from Mammie. So in essence, you're technically saying the same thing. But I truly believe for aesthetic purposes, a lot of people choose to use that name La Madama because it just sounds better to them. Now, if you are a person who is, a Black American derivative of an Afro-Latino culture. I totally get it. And I think the first thing that we really need to start doing is stop feeling such a hatred and being so triggered by that word, because it was a word that people did use. People, even Black children, referred to their mothers as Mammy. And even if that word does spark something in you that may not necessarily feel comfortable, it is the truth of the story behind this particular spirit guide. And if you want to work with this spirit guide, you have to embrace her truth. This is what she would have been called. So if you're calling out to La Madama, you are calling out to the Spanish Afro-Latino nannies from a certain area, a certain place in this world. That is who you are calling out to. And I would hope that your prayers, your petitions, your benedictions would go to her in her language. But if you are trying to reach out to the Black women that walked on the shores and that walked on the lands of the United States, her name was Mammie. Now, I want to get a little bit deeper into this, because one reason why we are truly triggered by this word, Mammie, is because of the falseness or the lies that have been told about her imagery, or just the entire imagery that surrounds Mammie. And my goal today is to also demystify this. Some people are going to love me for this, and some people are not going to love me for this. But again, I never podcast for people to agree with me. I podcast the truth. The next thing that you have to accept is that Mammie is not Big Mama. Mammie was not Big Mama. I truly believe that Big Mama is a separate spirit guide on her own too, and I will talk about that later. But what we have done and what we have allowed racist white America to do to us is brainwash us into believing that the caricature of the image that you see surrounding this spirit guide, that is actually what she looked like. This is who she was. What do you mean by that, Papa Seer? Well, let's break down the imagery. When we see the images of La Madama or Mammie, we see an older, darker skinned woman. She was a bigger woman, oftentimes heavy set, sometimes morbidly obese. And we have accepted that this is who she was, this is who she is, and this is what she looked like. Now, Big Mama is one thing, and we'll talk about her later. But Mammie, who she really was, we have to also break down historical evidence and the facts about what Mammie, who she really would have been during this time period. And to understand this, I think that it is important to have a background or a knowledge of antebellum slavery, Southern culture, because there are so many inaccuracies about the caricature that we tend to venerate and say this is who she was and this is who she is. First and foremost, a house slave, a household servant, a person who worked on a plantation or who was enslaved on a plantation and was not, who did not do field work. First and foremost, this would have been a person associated with a very wealthy family. Every hand on deck mattered. If you were a person who only owned, let's say, about 10 slaves or so, or something like that, every last one of them would have been doing some form of outside labor. So when we say that this was a woman who was primarily a household servant, she was only a household servant, she did not do field work, this was someone who came from a wealthy owner who had enough field hands on deck where this woman was not needed, keyword needed, in the field. This would have been a person who had a home that was so large and that needed so much additional care outside of the mistress of the home that they needed to hire, not use the word hire, but they needed someone to work primarily in the house. This would have been from a family where the mistress of the house would have felt like to do that type of labor would have been beneath her, or it would have been out of her social class to do these type of chores and this type of labor. Cooking, cleaning, being a seamstress, washing clothes, all of these type of things. What we have to realize is that not every person who owned slaves or who was involved in chattel slavery was a rich person. You didn't always have to be rich to own a slave. We also have to remember that there are levels to wealth as well. So anyone who had the resources to own a household servant who only did this type of work would have come from a very wealthy family. That means something. I'm going to get more into that too. Let's get back to her imagery. This idealism that this household servant was an older woman, that's false. The typical life expectancy for women on plantations at most was probably about 50. 50 is still very young. So this would have been a woman who was definitely under the age of 50 years old. This imagery of her being a bigger woman, that's false too. A lot of times people think because she worked in the kitchen that she would have been morbidly obese or she would have been overweight. That's not true either. Now, do I think she would have had a healthier, fuller appearance versus the other slaves on that plantation? Absolutely. I mean, she had access to all of the food, but you also have to remember that if you're working as a household servant on a plantation and all of the chores and all of the ripping and running and moving around that you have to do, this would have been a woman who was pretty physically fit, washing clothes by hand. If you've ever done that, hanging them out, having to not only cook food, but serve food, running behind children all day, cleaning each and every last room, which they typically would clean daily, sweeping, mopping, going to the market, doing all of these chores that required someone to be of a fit age as well as of a fit body to do. That imagery isn't correct either. Do I believe that Mammie was only a darker skinned woman? No, I do not. She would have come in many different shades of black. More often than not, she probably would have been a person that was biracial or of a mixed race. Why is this? Because during those times, any household servant typically was someone who was either lighter complected, had a lighter complexion, or they were physically very, very attractive. That was of the culture in the antebellum South, that you had very attractive household servants. Why would this have been? Because they would have been serving their guests. They would have been opening up the doors. These were people that they were looking at constantly, daily, because they did every little thing around the house. So typically what you find is that household servants were of a lighter complexion, not always, but a lot of times. And they typically were servants who were physically a lot more attractive than the field hands. Even down to the men who, would have driven the chariot or who would have been butlers and things of that nature. Physically, they were always a lot more attractive. So this image that Mammie was this woman who was unattractive, she only came in one shade, that's not true either. She actually would have been a very, very attractive woman. A very, very physically fit woman for all of the things and all of the chores that she had to do. Now, I can also back up my claims on this just because one of her main duties, one of her biggest duties, was child care, being a nursemaid. We know that a woman can produce milk at any age that she is able to give birth. But let's also just talk about the facts about that. That typically women start to decline and their ability to give birth after the age of 30. And during those times, women had children at a very, very, very young age and had multiple children. So if this woman was able to breastfeed, then that means that she would have been of a childbearing age. Many of these women were utilized as nursemaids. So someone's saying to me, well, Papa Seer, if this is the true image of Mammie, then why does she look the way that she does? Why is this the image that we have of her on the statues? Why was she depicted as this? To just be very, very blunt, for many reasons, but primarily it was to desexualize her. During those times, many of those slave owners were having relations with household servants. Many times you were brought into the home so that the master could have access to you 24/7 because he was engaged in some form of a sexual relationship with that house servant. Now, of course, this is still taboo during those times. And of course, making her into a caricature to desexualize the Black woman, to make her, less threatening in the house. And you don't really want people to know that you have this very gorgeous, highly skilled woman working in your house. What do? We change her appearance. We make her into someone who is very non-threatening. And this became very, very popularized in the late 1800s, walking us into the early 1900s when we see movies like Gone with the Wind, where Hattie Mae Daniels played Mammie, when we see movies like Birth of a Nation, where someone actually dressed in blackface and played a nanny, and so on and so forth, the imagery of Aunt Jemima. We tend to see that now this myth that is derivative of the American South has now become a cultural identity of the Black woman. That this is what she looks like. This is what we have. But if you were to actually go into those homes, that is not what was going on. And I think one of the best historical figures that I can even utilize as a representation of what I'm talking about, the first person that came to my mind was honestly Sally Hemings. And if anyone knows anything about Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, that was his mistress. She bore him children, many children as a matter of fact. But most importantly, she was the house servant. She cooked. Did Sally Hemings look like the imagery of the La Madamas or the Black Mammy statues? No, she didn't. She herself was biracial. She was gorgeous. She was beautiful. And people always talked. One of the things that made Thomas Jefferson popular when people came to his home, and I have been to his home many times on field trips, was they talked about how attractive his household servants were. It was literally one of the gossips that was going around town about him was that he had this very, very beautiful house servant, and it was rumored that he had children by her. Some of their children even went into society to pass as white passing citizens. Okay? So Sally Hemings is one of many that I probably could use, but she's the first one that comes to my mind. But no one wants to call her a mammy. But truly, that's what she was. She was a mammy. She was in the house, cooking, cleaning, doing household chores, and having babies for her master. She was a mammy. But we don't want to attach that we don't want to attach that to the light-skinned, long-haired, beautiful servant girl. She's cast in the role as the seductress and this and that and the third because it's sexier. It's a better aesthetic. But the truth about it was she was a mammy. So when we say that word, this depiction of a dark-skinned, overweight woman who only wore a scarf on her head, who dressed, in some plain dress, that's not the correct image of who she was. Mammie truly would have been a very attractive woman. She would have been better dressed than majority of the other slaves because she worked in the house. She was a seamstress, so you forget that she could make her own clothing. She would have been kept a lot better than a field hand. She would have been clean. She would have washed. She would have been around culture. She would have been around that old school antebellum Southern culture. She would have had knowledge of fashion, because who do you think would have been making the dresses for the mistresses? She would have had knowledge of etiquette. She would have had knowledge of culinary. She would have even had political knowledge depending upon who her master was, because she would have been surrounded by people who was constantly talking about politics and things that were going on at that time. She also would have been a much better spoken servant compared to the rest of the other field hands. She was the English that she was listening to would have been quote unquote culturally accepted as proper English versus the language of the enslaved individuals on the plantation. So her speech would have been different. She was not in conversation with field hands most of the day. She was in conversation with her white owners, the mistresses, the master. These are the people that she would have been around day to day for the majority of her day. It wouldn't even surprise me if many of these women knew how to read and write because they were in the home. So when you look at these statues and you look at this imagery, I want you to remember my words today and understand that it's false. These are not accurate depictions of who these spirit guides are derivative of the women that they were derivative of. Now, from the Black American cultural perspective, is there some truth in this imagery? Is there anything about this that could be perceived as true? I say yes. But I don't associate it necessarily with La Madama or Mammie. You see, there's another woman that comes into play here. Again, all under the same spirit guide archetype. But today, we're talking about three different women. And this next one I want to talk about, which I truly believe many of us as Black Americans, especially in modern day spirituality, who we're reaching out to, who's coming through for us, and that's Big Mama. And Big Mama was different. Big Mama was not Mammie. A lot of times she didn't even go by that name, and it just depends on where you're from, and in the United States or what time period you come from. But I know for a fact many of you are millennials just like me, or Gen Z that actually listen to this podcast. So Big Mama was definitely a person that you knew that she might even still be alive. But there is some truth there. Now, do I have to go into who Big Mama is? I think I am, for those who don't know. Many of us in Black American culture have a woman in our life who shared a lot of the same skill set as La Madama and Mammie, but we didn't call her that. A lot of us do have a woman in our family, oftentimes a grandmother, great-grandmother, great-great-grandmother, auntie, who was more of a heavy-set woman, and she shared a lot of the same skill set as these previous women because she is the ancestor. She's the child of these women. She came from them. So a lot of these skills were definitely passed down generation to generation to generation. But as we know, with Black American culture, with our food, with the freedoms that we have now, with life expectancy, which has definitely increased since the days of slavery, Big Mama was eating good. She is still eating very, very well. Soul food is designed to put some good, healthy weight on you. Not always healthy, but that's what it does. This was a woman who cooks, and she cooked a lot. She had the freedom to. This was a woman whose love, her energy, and where she did her best work oftentimes was in the kitchen or in the home. This was a woman who cooked many feasts for us different times of the year. Easter, Sunday, Christmas, Thanksgiving, your birthday, someone else's birthday, Sunday dinners if you come from a family where ritually you all eat together every single Sunday. So Big Mama is always cooking. This is just what she does. And a lot of us have this woman that is closer to us in ancestry than we do, to be honest with you, Mammie or La Madama or the women that they are derivative of. We know who Big Mama is. And so I do think, and this isn't me just, bashing the imagery of La Madama or Mammie at all. I'm not bashing it, even though I'm speaking the facts as to where it comes from. A lot of us do find a sense of comfort when we see this woman, this heavier set woman. She has her apron on, she's sweeping, she's doing these things that are doing, because this is a person that you knew. This is a person that you still know to this day. So instantly, you feel comforted by this imagery, even as triggering as it can be sometimes. For many of us, in the back of our heads, we know that we come from a woman with a lot of these qualities or a lot of this aesthetic. Does it make her any less attractive? I don't think so. But I just think it's time to just really differentiate who these women are, their backstories, even though it's, again, all under the same archetype, but understand where this comes from. As Black Americans, I think it's time for us to claim a lot of our culture, especially if you do not hail from an Afro-Latino or Latin American, or, if that's not in your bloodline, to just call it for what it is. If it's Big Mama's spirit that you reaching out to, then call her by her name. That's who she was. That's who she is. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think, honestly, that puts more of a cultural identity as to who we are today on things. And believe you me, that spirit will respond to you. She knows you. She may or may not necessarily be your ancestor, but the spirits, these women, because oftentimes when they come as a host of spirits, meaning more than one of them, will respond to you. So I don't think there's anything wrong with that. If you're fine with Madama, Mammie, that's totally fine. But I'm very specific when it comes to spiritual work, and you need to know who you are reaching out to. And I think as time progresses, our spiritual practices are going to evolve. They're going to change. Things are going to be added to them because our cultural identity, our culture is consistently transforming itself. So in 2024, I think many of you are really reaching out to Big Mama, because Big Mama would have been an older, heavy-set woman. Mammie would not have been. Big Mama would have been. Mammie's life expectancy wasn't past 50, but we know Big Mama, even to this day, some of them have reached past 100. She was older. She was at a time in her life where the most important values to her would have been her family, providing for the household, taking care of the household, taking care of the children, not just her own. But many of us were raised by our grandmothers. Many of us were raised, including myself, many of us were raised by our grandmothers. So I think it's important for you as a Black American in modern society to recognize where your history and where your culture plays a part into this too. And that does walk me into my next piece of this, which is the argument surrounding these spirit guides. And because there is this consistent argument that even goes on today. And it's the argument of who is allowed to work with these spirits, who is allowed to call out to these spirits, who should not. She's ours, she's not yours, you're not from here, you can't call out to her, this is that and the third. My opinion on this, and this is Papa Seer's opinion, it doesn't make it right, does not make me the all-saying seer over spirituality, but my opinion is that the spirit that reaches out to you is the spirit that you can work with. Okay, I've said on this podcast many times before to never go looking. Allow spirit to find you. If they want you, they're gonna find you. They're gonna reach out to you. If Mammie, Big Mama, La Madama has reached out to you, that's who you need to be working with. But just make sure she is who she says she is. Make sure that that this is who you are working with, who you say you are working with. Make sure that it's her. I'm not the spiritual police, so I'm not here to police anyone's spirituality. But this goes into something a little bit deeper too. I have talked about this, on a few different occasions. And this is, a lot of people, especially Black Americans, feeling like white people, Caucasians, this isn't a spirit that is for them. They shouldn't be praying to her. They shouldn't have anything to do with her. They need to leave her alone. Leave her where she is. She's ours. Leave it be. Now, in the past, I've definitely had some strong opinions about this. And I still have a very strong personal opinion about this. But as a spiritual leader and as, being a person where the things that I say, a lot of people hold on to them, I have to challenge my personal opinion with a public opinion. So this is my public opinion about this. Again, I don't say things for people to agree with me. Who am I to tell you who you can and cannot work with? I don't have to agree with it. I don't have to like it. That's how I feel personally. But who am I to say to you that this spirit is not active and didn't reach out to you and doesn't have something for you in your life? This brings me back to history, especially when it comes to Caucasian people. The hard pill that us as Black Americans, what we have to swallow about this is that a lot of these women, Big Mama, Madama, Mammie, they worked in white households. Whether it was in slavery or whether it was employment, these were the people that they worked for. You have to remember too that not every person who employed or even enslaved a woman of this archetype was a monster to her. You can feel how you want about slavery. I have my own opinions too. But some of these women, many of these women, were taken care of very well. Sometimes their owners left them land, set their families free. Sometimes, they would send them homes with all types of gifts. A lot of these women really, truly did forge bonds, even with the Caucasian children that they raised. I think any woman probably would. If you have nursed a child since infancy and then you watch this child grow up, regardless of the race or the situation, it's still a child. It was still innocent at one point in time. I do think that there were some attachments that were formed. This was a child that was sucking the milk away from your body. Sometimes these women would have their baby on one breast and then the masters or their owners or the person that they were working for on the other breast. Sometimes they would bring their children with them to work with them, all kinds of things. We have historical evidence that the children of the house servants even played with the children of the masters. We have historical evidence of that. So to say that there wasn't or couldn't have been potentially some bonds formed with these families, I think that we're really going to have to open up our minds when it comes to this. I'm going somewhere with this because I know this is the part of the podcast where a lot of people just probably not going to agree with me, and that is just totally fine. We are all entitled to our own opinions. Do I think that it is okay for Caucasians to bring this imagery into their home, into their space, into their practice, or even to be posting, on social media that they have these dolls, they have these statues? No, I do not. I think it's 100% tone deaf. I think it's very, very triggering. And you really need to learn how to read the room. Unfortunately, a lot of us don't feel the need to educate you on things like this, and that's fine too. Everyone is entitled to how they feel, but I feel the need to educate you because I have a lot of people who are Caucasian who do respect this podcast and who do respect me, so I'm going to use this moment to educate you. Okay, first and foremost, you don't have to have a statue, this imagery, this triggering imagery in your possession to venerate or to work with said spirit. Now, I will question you on this, and I will place this bit of conviction on you. If you feel comfortable knowing the history between these women and white Americans, if you feel comfortable still asking this spirit for anything as a aesthetically white American, that's between you and God. I don't think that I would be able to feel comfortable enough doing that. But hey, I can't stop you from doing something. We've tried. And it doesn't stop Caucasians from involving themselves in practices that are traditionally African American, African, and so on and so forth. So again, I'm not here to police nobody, but just to offer some education about some things. You would also want to make sure that this spirit truly has reached out to you. You want to make sure that you are really working with who you say you are working with. And then question yourself as to why. Why would this Black woman be coming to me? This is the perfect time to start digging into your history a little bit more too. Because she might be related to you. Your family might owe her something. We don't think about that, right? Your family might actually owe her something. Or it possibly could have been a situation where maybe your family or your ancestors was attached to a woman like this, and maybe there was a pretty decent relationship, and she might be here to help you because she might have helped your family once upon a time. It is, I'm cringing now saying these things out of my mouth, but I feel like in all fairness, they just have to be said, because I feel like we're so quick to chastise, but never to really look at the whole scenario on how things might play out. My personal opinion is my personal opinion, but what I'm doing right now is I'm offering my public opinion. Again, I don't think that you need to bring the statue into the house. I don't think you need any imagery of it, because for you to even have it in your possession says a lot about you. It's triggering, and I guarantee you, any of your Black friends, anybody that is Black in your spiritual community is going to feel some type of way seeing you with this type of imagery. I know I would. And I'm going to look at you crazy. I'm going to second guess what you're doing with it. And why would you even have it in your possession? Now, again, if you can confirm that this spirit is here for you and she really is here to work with you, I can't stop that. But I do think that it is important, if you are Caucasian American or just, from a different diaspora, that it's something that you want to keep to yourself. It is not something that you want to be waving around loud and proud, especially if you own the imagery. I think it's something that you probably really just want to keep to yourself and let said relationship just be what it is. And if this woman has come to guide you, allow her to guide you, but most importantly, allow her to educate you. Because who's to say that these spirits are not coming down for Caucasians to, and also sensitize you all to the plight, the struggles in the past of people of color? Who's to say that she isn't coming through as a spirit guide to educate you on that? Maybe you are a Caucasian woman who has mixed children. I could definitely see this spirit coming into your life to help you raise these children and keep them aware of their, their Black identity as well. I could see this. I'm not a person who isn't beyond having grace for someone. But again, be very mindful that what you're doing is still very triggering for many people. And if you just can't get past that you really need this image or this statue in your house, which I do not agree with, you had better make sure that you put it somewhere where no one else can see it. And you sit with your own conviction. That is between you and the Lord. I have nothing to do with that. But you better put it somewhere where no one can see it. And you sit again with your own conviction on that. Because I'm not here to police anyone. I'm just here to podcast, offer commentary, and offer facts about things, as well as my opinion. If we were to open up our minds about the potentiality of this archetype of spirit guide, everyone might find something that they did not realize about her. Her imagery might change for you. What she is assigned to do for you in your life may very well change for you. Or if this is a spirit guide that has not offered her assistance to you as of yet, you might find that now the roads are open for her. I think also for those of us who have a Madama or a Mammie or a Big Mama in our life, I do think it's time that maybe evolve the imagery of her. There is nothing wrong with making your own dolls. There's nothing wrong with having someone else make a doll for you. I think there's nothing wrong with making sure that we are accurate in the depiction of who these women were. Because a lot of these women were your ancestors, and that's just the truth. That is just the facts. For me, and in my opinion, I truly believe that the Madama, Mammie, Big Mama spirits are literally just a host of women spirits that come together as one. As one. I separated them three today so that you could see the differences culturally in who they were, Big Mama versus Mammie versus Madama. But again, and I've said this many times on this podcast today, they're all under this same spiritual archetype. So the work and what they do is always going to remain the same, but knowing who they are, knowing their stories, and having accuracy in who they are, again, helps form intimacy in the relationship. Helps them want to work with you a lot more and guide you and protect you and do the amazing things that spirit guides do for us. I will be talking more about this spirit in depth in my upcoming course, which is entitled Shamanic Spiritism, as well as my upcoming standalone class, Spiritualism in You. It's been a while since I have been teaching classes publicly, so I am so back to work and looking forward to those of you who want to join me in that experience. For more information about these courses and these upcoming classes, you can definitely go to hoodooconjurerootwork.com or short hcrgold.com. I will also post a link to the flyers as well as the class registration pages in this podcast link. I do not consider this necessarily hoodoo, but very much in the realm of spiritismo and as well as in the realm of spiritism or spiritualism. Okay, you do not have to necessarily be a hoodooist or to participate in the religion or the power or culture of hoodoo to work with these spirits. They stand alone and they can do what they need to do on their own. I do think that it enhances the gift. I do think it enhances the experience, but I wouldn't step out on a limb and say that this is quote unquote hoodoo. This is very much spiritualism at its finest. And to learn more about spiritualism, to more about shamanic spiritualism, Black American spiritualism, again, I do offer you all to, join me for class. I am so looking forward to those of you who have already signed up for these courses. These are going to be great. My Spiritualism in You class, which will be in December, on December the 8th. It is going to be a very, very in-depth class on the tenets of spiritualism, which have not been talked about in depth for many people. A lot of people think spiritualism is just believing in a lot of different things, and that's not necessarily true. This is an actual system with its own tenets and its own ways and its own beliefs. So we're going to talk about that. And our shamanic spiritism course, that is going to be 16 weeks. Okay. It is one of our most highly recognized courses. We used to do it for 8 weeks, myself and my godchild, Reve Ashe. We have now updated this course to 16 weeks. So I look forward to meeting all of you all during that time. I hope today that this podcast was able to demystify these spirit guides, as well as give you a more historically accurate depiction of who these women were. I hope that this podcast was able to help you understand more about who these spirits are, the role they play in your life, but most importantly, like I said, who they are. And I implore you all to go back and even take a listen to my old podcast from 2022 about La Madama and Mammie. Of course, you can always search it in the podcast bar, wherever you get your podcasts, or on YouTube, wherever you may be, listening to me today. And just maybe compare and contrast where my head is today versus where it was 2 years ago. And again, I appreciate all of you all for your continued support, listening to the podcast for so many years, even during the times when I haven't been posting, and just supporting me on YouTube and all of these endeavors. Again, I look forward to meeting some of you all that I have not met in these upcoming courses. And, just thank you for listening today. I'm so looking forward to getting back to podcasting regularly. Again, as always, you all, thank you all for coming out today. I bless your hands, your feet, your coming, your going. May spirit find you in all of the corners of the universe. May the roads be open to all of the things that you aspire to be, the things that you aspire to have, and most importantly, for all of God's blessings to just be in your forecast and in your path. May the things you touch materialize as if it were gold. My people, I send you out in love, light, peace, and most importantly, protection. And with that, I release you into the atmosphere.